Welcome back to the main stage. Quel plaisir de vous revoir à la scène principale. I hope you enjoyed the networking, visiting the marketplace, and meeting a few of our fantastic sponsors. If you're just joining us now, don't worry about missing the excellent sessions this morning. We're recording all of the Tourism Congress sessions, and they'll be available to TIAC members in the TIAC member portal later next week. Si vous venez tout juste de vous joindre à nous, ne vous inquiétez pas d'avoir manqué les séances passionnantes de ce matin. Toutes les séances du Congrès touristique sont enregistrées et seront à la disposition des membres de l'AITC sur le portail des membres de l'AITC plus tard la semaine prochaine. Et n'oubliez pas que le sous-titrage en français est disponible pour les sessions de la séance de la scène principale. Vous pouvez accéder au sous-titrage en cliquant sur le lien figurant dans la description de la séance. Our next session, Grounded, Air Travel and Canada's Visitor Economy, is sponsored by the Canadian Airports Council. During this session, our special guest moderator, Tamara Vrooman, President and CEO of the Vancouver Airport Authority, will lead a panel discussion with Mark Nasser of Air Canada and John Wetherill of WestJet. I'm looking forward to hearing their insights into how reduced air travel impacts Canada's tourism industry and how we can bring more visitors to our country. Tamara, you are cleared for takeoff.
Hello, bonjour. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us at this important Tourism Congress. You know, it's a very important time for our industry, of course, and I'm delighted to be able to have two panelists with me today to talk about a sector that has been particularly hard hit by the pandemic and the travel restrictions associated with it. My two guests today are John Wetherill, who is the Vice President of Network and Revenue at WestJet, and Mark Nasser, who's Air Canada's Vice President of Loyalty and E-commerce. John and Mark, welcome. Hello, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Tamara. Hi, Mark.
Before we get into it, maybe what we can do is, could you give our audience here just a quick snapshot? You know, adjectives almost don't describe quite what it's like for the aviation sector these days, but give us a snapshot of what things look like from your perspective. Maybe, John, we could start with you.
Yeah, so happy to do that. I think probably first and foremost is the impact that we've seen on our people. Tamara, we're currently operating with about 4,000 active WestJetters, and that's down about 70% from where we were pre-pandemic. We had about 14,000 active employees pre-pandemic, and obviously that's a result of the massive drop in demand that we've seen, and that's been extremely difficult for us, both those who are still working and those who are not working. You know, capacity for us is down about 80% on a year-over-year basis, and that's a level that we've been at essentially since July. So we've been kind of stuck at a negative 80% capacity rate. And unfortunately, demand is down even more than that. For anyone who watches the weekly statistics from CATSA that show us how many travelers are going through Canadian airports these days, it's sitting at 14 or 15% of historical volumes, so down 85 or 86%. And just a few statistics that I think kind of illustrate the impact that COVID is having on our business. And we know that the impact on our business is felt by communities across the country and every sector of the economy that relies on the investments that we make.
Thanks so much.
Well, I guess I'll take it from here. You know, John, I think that's a great description, and we're seeing very similar numbers. You know, first and foremost, impact to our people and their families and the broader communities, and of course, what we can see in terms of passenger traffic. Maybe I'll, you know, since the story is similar, I'll just focus on another aspect of it. I'm in Montreal today, but I'm based in Toronto. I stayed in a hotel last night. The hotel I stayed in has 7% occupancy. In it, there was 2 employees in the entire hotel on shift when I arrived at around 8 p.m. During normal times, there would probably be something closer to 50 or 60, and then even more so if there was a conference or an event going on. So you think about the impact to the lodging industry. All of the restaurants, other than one in Montreal Airport, at least that I noticed, were closed last night. You think about the impact in the culinary industry. You know, this morning it took, I think, about 15 minutes for me to get my Uber, whereas there would usually be just a whole litany of drivers waiting to do a morning pickup. Same thing with taxis and livery. And so you think about the impacts on those communities, and the state of affairs right now is urgent. It is horrific, and it is worse in Canada than it is in other countries for our industry.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a good reminder of the fact that, of course, our industry, the tourism industry, really is an ecosystem which consists of large players and key parts like airlines, all the way down to independently owned businesses, many of whom have had very successful livelihoods for decades, and now are being thrown into threat of bankruptcy because of this situation. And it is a unique situation. We have very robust tourism sector in our country. We have people, we have demand, we have people who want to come and to experience all that we have to offer. And we have a supply of very healthy and competitive airlines, as in the case of WestJet and Air Canada, and also a number of players and properties who are willing. Yet we have a virtual economic shutdown because of a significant global health event. So given that tourism is so dependent on the movement of people, we are at our core a people business and connecting people to different geographies. And aviation, and of course, air travel plays such a key role in that. And given these unique situations, what are some of your thoughts about what the government needs to be doing to support aviation and the overall tourism sector during this time? Maybe, Mark, we can start with you.
Sure. Thank you. I'd break it up maybe into two categories. There's what we need to do immediately to have things restart, but then there's also focusing on what the long-term consequences could be and ensuring that there aren't long-term systemic consequences that can affect us for many, many years to come in the broader tourism industry. So to focus on the first, very simple answer, a science-based, largely likely routed in testing program to be able to facilitate free movement, across borders, but even across Canada. We have this great, amazing country, and significant parts of the country are closed off. And especially as I think about the holidays, there's tremendous amount of, work in one place, have family in another between the western part of the country and the Atlantic provinces. So the number one thing I think we need as an industry, and we need immediately, is there to be a testing regime that's put in place, which is backed with now fantastic data from studies that have been done in Canada. So we're not relying on any third-party circumstance or experience here, that says 14-day blanket quarantines are not necessary. They're not effective, actually. We believe that as many as 30% of people are actually skipping out on their quarantine obligations. Instead, test people when they arrive, potentially test them before departure. On a negative test, release people with precaution, and then potentially a follow-up test to fully release them from quarantine, and having the satisfaction of knowing that for sure, they're not, carrying the disease. In terms of the long term, and a number of leaders in the industry, I know, and John's team as well have been very clear about this. There's a number of things that it took Canada decades and decades to build: air traffic control infrastructure, airports, airport investment for great facilities, the airlines, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we need is to ensure that there's an adequate regime of government support in place, so that there isn't bankruptcies or failures or other things that would make it much more difficult to put back together the infrastructure, so that if the demand starts to come, we actually have the people, the capacity, the facilities to be able to satisfy that demand. And we've talked about targeted support packages for the industry to enable us to just live, to fight another day as things start to recover.
Yeah, absolutely. And really want to commend the work that Air Canada has done in partnership with Toronto Pearson Airport and McMaster University. Our sector hasn't been waiting for government action, have proactively put forward tests to make sure that we prove the science and build the confidence that will allow governments to act. So that test is very important. And we have one ourselves here at YVR in partnership with WestJet around rapid testing on departure. So hopefully we put enough of these examples in place that we can have take up on a more comprehensive solution across the country, as you said.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to
Go
interrupt.
ahead, Mark, go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Just since you brought up the Pearson test run by McMaster Health Labs, actually just a couple of hours ago, the results of the study, the interim results came out. So I thought maybe I could just give a very quick briefing so everybody knows. Essentially, the way it worked is you land in Pearson internationally, you're invited to do a test, and then another test at 7 days and another test at 14 days. 20,000 tests were conducted, around 9,000 participants between September 3rd and October 2nd. And the results were, according to the interim study released this morning, 99% of study participants tested negative for COVID-19 throughout all the tests, all three tests. Only 1% tested positive, and of those 1%, 0.7, 70% were detected on arrival, so day 0 at the airport, and the remaining 0.3 were detected at day 7. And so, the study offer from McMaster went in so far as to suggest that a 7-day quarantine, the science backs directly, not even getting into, a testing regime like what Calgary has set up now.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important data point, and I know that press release is now out, so I'd invite participants in this Congress to check it out, because it does start to provide some much needed data about what actually is the testing exposure and experience like in aviation and travel. And I think the other thing that was really interesting about that study is the fact that so many people voluntarily participated in the study with no real benefit to them. Their quarantine wasn't going to be reduced. It was just to provide the information. So I think what that tells us is that we know that there is demand from the public to start flying and to participate in tourism again, once they have the confidence and the science that it is safe to do so.
Yeah,
and so, John, from your point of view, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think Mark, that was a very comprehensive answer by Mark. So I don't have a lot to add to it. Just to reiterate, though, we're looking for consistency in terms of a framework for travel across the country, because as Mark alluded to, it is inconsistent right now and it's confusing. It's confusing for us from time to time, let alone for the traveling public. And so we're looking for greater cooperation, and it's not just about removing barriers. Obviously, we would like to remove barriers, but we want to do that with a science-based approach, as you both made reference to. So we want the science to dictate how and when those barriers should be removed, because there is no sense in forcing 99-point-something% of the public to quarantine unnecessarily. That's destructive and disruptive to the economy and to people's lives, and we are strongly advocating for a science-based approach, as I know both of you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Science and confidence. That's the way we talk about it. We need both in order to get people moving safely again. And so I think talking about people moving safely, all parts of our country, it's a vast geography, as we all know, need access to air travel, not only for the movement of people, but also for the movement of high value goods, PPE, medical equipment, soon we hope vaccines, all part of ensuring that we have a robust economy, but also a healthy community and healthy society. As you know, the pandemic has wreaked havoc on our two main carriers, and you've reluctantly had to pull back from some regional routes. The Government of Canada and the speech from the throne talked a little bit about the importance of regional connectivity. What are some of your thoughts? I'm going to start with you, John. What are some of your thoughts about how we balance what I know to be our two domestic carriers' commitments to all parts of the country with the ability to operate in these challenging times?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm happy to start. First of all, we are committed to all parts of the country. Absolutely. We, for the vast majority of COVID to date, we maintained service to all 38 of the domestic cities and communities that we were serving at the outset of COVID. Unfortunately, we got to a point where we had to make a difficult decision, and in particular, we pulled out of a number of our routes in Atlantic Canada, markets in Atlantic Canada, and suspended service to those places. And we did that with a lot of difficult decision making, and it was not an easy decision for us to take because we know how impactful that is for communities, for the reasons you've just described, Tamara, for our people who work at those stations as well. But we had gotten to a point where we simply couldn't sustain the service any longer. The Atlantic bubble is obviously particularly restrictive in terms of air travel and access to that part of the country, and so we simply couldn't continue to operate effectively empty aircraft in and out of the region, unfortunately. But I think it's also important to note this is not just a regional or a small community issue for the industry right now. I think Mark can probably attest we are losing money on every flight that we fly these days, and whether that is to a small community or whether that is a flight between Vancouver and Toronto, the demand is so low and the fixed costs in our industry are so high that that we're in a very difficult position. So I don't want to give the impression that this is simply a regional issue, although the regional connectivity is incredibly important. We recognize that, and I don't think anyone at WestJet undertook that decision lightly.
So do you have any thoughts about what it would take to get those routes back up and running again?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's as we just talked about in the kind of the last part of the conversation. It's having obviously we're looking at catalysts for demand in air travel, and the ultimate catalyst will be a vaccine, and it's anyone's guess as to when that will be kind of available and sufficiently distributed throughout the population to be considered effective. But until then, we're looking for, let's say, micro catalysts and testing as a means to quarantine relief or removal of travel restrictions. In our mind is the path to improving the viability of some of those types of markets in the short term. And I think that's number one. The other piece is around confidence. You mentioned it previously, Tamara. Getting confidence back into the traveling public around the fact that air travel is safe. And I think we were pretty encouraged to hear the comments of Dr. Tam, the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada last week. She reinforced that COVID transmission on board aircraft is exceedingly rare. And I think, in fact, that she said she's not aware of any cases in Canada of in-flight transmission being reported to provincial health authorities. And so I think that's really important to kind of reflect on that. I think everyone who's participating in the session today should be repeating that to anyone who's willing to listen, because that's a bit of a shift in the debate and the tone that we've heard relative to the last few months from the government. But even so, we get a lot of mixed messages, and even though certainly at WestJet, and I know Air Canada is the same, as an industry, we have done everything that we can to make travel as safe as possible in these times. And yet we often see from different government agencies statements to the contrary and discouraging people from traveling at all. And so that doesn't build confidence, unfortunately. And again, we want the science to dictate the approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get to confidence in a minute. We have a really good question coming in from the audience, which I will move to in a moment. But before I did that, I want to give you an opportunity, Mark, to give us a picture from the regional connectivity and the regional debate that I know has been covered a lot in the media. Air Canada has been public about the fact that it was thinking about reducing a significant number of routes, but then paused to see what discussions with the federal government could look like. So give us a sense of how you see that regional connectivity issue being addressed from Air Canada's point of view.
Sure. Well, I thought John said it very well, and certainly amongst us, he's the expert on this topic and many others, I'm sure. Maybe I'll add two quick things. First of all, it's a gut-wrenching decision for us, especially when it's a station versus a particular route. Even a particular route is very hard, but it's closing a station or pausing service to a station is gut-wrenching, and it's not lost on us at all the impact that it could have on the local community and the local economy. In many of these smaller stations, particularly in Atlantic Canada, there might be, let's say, an anchor business or two in the community that particularly relies on the air service. But like John said, where there simply isn't demand, in fact, not only isn't there not demand, but there are active restrictions and active discouragement of travel, even when following all of the safety protocols and measures, which have now been proven to be safe, then, it's an impossible situation. And I think, the link certainly to the conversations of the government, right? These local regional routes are often made possible by their connectivity to the broader network. That's both throughout Canada and the US, as well as, particularly in Air Canada's case, long haul international. And I think, something that WestJet has been very vocal about, which is true, I believe the Canadian carriers have now ceded 20 points of market share to international carriers serving Canada. And what we have to remember is that foreign governments around the world are heavily subsidizing their airlines. In fact, out of the top 20 airlines in the world, there's only 2 of them, Air Canada being one, to have not received direct government aid, and 18 of them are over $1 billion. Actually, many of them 5 billion or up. And so if you're a foreign carrier that's being flush full of, forget loans, but straight out government cash, and you can continue, for example, flying to Canada, that makes it, non-viable for a Canadian carrier potentially to have competitive service. And so all of this is linked. In order to serve as many local, and small community routes, the network has to be as strong as possible. And there has to be, demand, and Canada's aviation industry has to be put in a competitive position, which at this point absolutely requires, some policy support and some economic support from the federal government.
Yeah, Mark, I think you make a really good point there about the fact that it's not just a domestic issue when we're thinking about connectivity to regional communities across our national geography. It's also an international one, because what we know from other contexts in other parts of the world, and also at other times during our own history here, that when international carriers are able to come in at lower costs and increased competitiveness because of the support that they've been provided from their home governments, they take the big routes, right? They cream the best of the business, and that connectivity that is so essential to the network working across our country, that is supported largely, as it is in every country, with domestic carriers, which is why governments around the world have been supporting their domestic carriers in the way that you described is so important. Thanks for making that point. So as we move to confidence, the question here from the audience, I'm going to read it directly in a second, but we do know that during COVID, travel on an airplane or through an airport is sort of one of the best kept secrets. We all know what it's like to go to a grocery store, to a restaurant, to get our hair cut during COVID. But because so few of us, have been traveling, most of us, even people who used to travel frequently, can't quite imagine what the process looks like. So we've talked a little bit about reminding folks on some stats on some of the positions that Teresa Tam and others have been mentioning around the really very, very remote risk, 0 in the case of Canada so far, of transmission aboard an aircraft. What else can we be doing as an industry to promote the confidence in the public that it's safe to travel? John, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that we're aligned as an industry around reinforcing that every stakeholder in the process is taking all necessary precautions. That's airports, that's airlines, government agencies, even travelers themselves. Everyone is doing their part to make sure that air travel is safe. WestJet, we've implemented more than 20 additional health and hygiene measures as part of our Safety Above All program. I know Air Canada has done something very similar. I think the experience looks very much like it did before for those who haven't traveled. I've traveled only domestically. I know Mark's traveled a lot more internationally since COVID has come into effect. But the experience looks very much like it did before, aside from the requirement to wear masks on board the aircraft. And WestJet has a zero tolerance policy on the mask issue, and there's some adjustments to in-flight service. But generally, things look as they did. In fact, airports, unfortunately, are less busy than they were, so lineups are pretty rare. I think it's just reinforcing the fact that the statistics and the science and the research indicates that the risk is exceedingly low. And IATA reports that it's 1 in 27 million. I think I'm getting that stat right. 1 in 27 million is your chance of transmitting or contracting COVID on board an aircraft. Far lower risk than your typical day-to-day activity, like going to the grocery store, things that people are still doing on a regular basis. So I think it's important to reinforce that. And the last point I'll mention before I turn to Mark for his views is that we see we're doing a lot of research, of course, in the market to understand how people are feeling about travel and where their concerns lie. And we see roughly equal proportions of respondents who are concerned about contracting COVID on board an aircraft, as are concerned about contracting COVID at the destination.
Right.
And so it's not just, obviously, it's not just about getting there. It's also about, where you are and do you feel safe at the destination. So for the tourism industry in general, it's important to make sure that we're jointly communicating all of the activities that have been undertaken to make sure that travel, not just air travel, but that travel is safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, with an eye to the clock, I want to make sure I give you an opportunity to give your thoughts. How do we build confidence, and how do we get these messages out about our experience? I would say I've traveled on both your airlines, and it is a very easy to navigate and highly safe and clean experience. So it's been great.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. And I very much agree with John's comments, right? The industry has gotten its reputation for safety by cooperating on safety. And now, hygiene very much in the mix, core of safety. Here's maybe the thing that I'll say, and I'll take maybe a little bit of a different perspective to the same outcome. I don't think as an industry, we're trying to go back to 2019 demand levels next month, right? So from our extensive survey data, third party, first party conversations we've had, et cetera, what I will say is we are absolutely confident that there are tremendously more people willing to and interested in traveling right now than are traveling. So I'm not saying there isn't a confidence issue, like there will still be a large portion of people that we will need to convince, but there is just this latent demand that exists, and it's government policy, plain and simple. So if we want to get, in order to get our business back to 100%, well, we need to cross 50% and 70%, et cetera. If we had, the consistent, John very much talked about the importance of consistency, a consistent, easier to follow regime. If we had the science-based testing in place, if we had, maybe some rethinking of some of the travel advisory language, because if you actually go online and read it, it's quite concerning. It's quite scary. If we kind of collectively had that policy change, then we would see a lot more traffic than what we're seeing right now. Now, again, would that get us back to last year's demand levels? No. And there will still be additional work that needs to happen with destinations being safe, with additional safeguards. And then there's a risk of people that are just at, category of people that are at higher risk, that will need, obviously the medical, precautions in place. But I go right back to kind of your last question. We really do need some solid, additional solid action and consistency from regulatory authorities and government.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a question, as we said, of getting the data and the science, and to be led by science. We do, in our own research here at YVR, also see similar numbers. People are willing to travel, provided that there is a clear and consistent testing regime, including rapid testing on departure, and that quarantines can be managed, and they have some certainty, to your point, John, about the consistency of protocols applied in hotels and ground tour operators and so on throughout the tourism ecosystem. So I think we're just about out of time here, but on behalf of those watching here and on behalf of TIAC, I really wanted to thank you for sharing your insights. I think you've built a lot of clarity with respect to how the decisions have been made and what we need to do in order to build that science and confidence piece going forward. So to John and Mark, thank you so much for your time here today. And I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that is still a lot to think about, a lot of work to be done yet. I don't know about you, but I was really firmly buckled into my seat throughout that entire session. The discussion was, it certainly elevated the issues facing the airlines and the impact on that the pandemic has had on the visitor economy. Thank you, Tamara, Mark, and John, for your insights. C'était une excellente séance avec Tamara, Mark et John, démontrant les enjeux de la COVID-19 sur nos compagnies aériennes. And thank you once again to the Canadian Airports Council for sponsoring this session. Je remercie encore une fois le Conseil des aéroports du Canada pour avoir commandité cette séance. Now, I don't know about you, but I had a hard time choosing from all of the great sessions coming up in the TIAC Talk series. There are so many important issues to discuss today. So let's get started. Je ne sais pas si c'était le cas pour vous, mais j'ai eu de la vraie difficulté à choisir parmi toutes les séances passionnantes de la série de causeries de l'AITC Parle qui s'en viennent. Il y a tellement de questions importantes à aborder aujourd'hui, alors ne perdons pas une minute.